So I'd like to thank everyone for joining. The focus today, our penetration test debt. Myself, Ernesto Pellegrino, Chief Technology Officer at Assurance IT, helping organizations become cyber resilient. I'm joined today here with Laurent from GoSecure. Again, the focus is on pen tests, how to get value if you do perform a pen test, and really just to uncover those vulnerabilities in your environment and what benefit you get putting in place actions or remediations in order to get better, right? So some housekeeping notes. The call scheduled from 1 to 2 p.m. today. We do believe we can complete the call in about 45 minutes. We are recording the session. All participants will be muted. I will be the moderator for today's call. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, we're going to try to keep this as interactive as possible. Please just add them in the chat. I will be moderating those questions and asking them either throughout the call or at the end of the call, where we will reserve some time for some question and answer period. So why pen test, right? So like I was mentioning to Laurent, you can't protect what you don't know, essentially. So, pen tests are still and have been a tool that organizations could use really to uncover those vulnerabilities. And when we look at, how we can protect, there are several approaches you can use to enhance the protection of your network and devices. Right. The Canadian Center of Cybersecurity, they have identified 13 security controls that you can implement to effectively enhance your cybersecurity posture. Right. So today, we'll look at how we can uncover these vulnerabilities and what are resolution best practices when leveraging a pen test. So I'll hand it off to Laurent. Well, he'll focus on how to how to get the most value from a penetration test and how to protect against those ever-evolving threats of cyber attacks. So Laurent, I hand off. You're in presenter mode. You're good to go.
All right, thank you very much. You should all see my screen. So thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you so much to Assurance IT for inviting me here to present. So my name is Laurent Desaulniers. I'm the Vice President of the Breach Detect and Response Services at GoSecure, and I have several other hobbies such as pickpocketing, lockpicking, and magic. So anything deception-based, really. Ernesto was graceful enough to, in this introduction, to mention that we would like this to be as interactive as possible. So by all means, ask questions. Don't wait until the end. Ernesto is an amazing MC, so he'll take notes. He'll be a moderator. So by all means, feel free to interrupt, interject. If you agree or disagree, by all means, you're more than welcome to interact. So as I mentioned is in the introduction, it's been at least 20 years since I've been told that pen testing is dead. We can see here several slides, tweets, or report by many people saying pen testing is dying. But then I'm wondering, if pen testing is dying, how come we're so busy? How come everybody in the pen testing industry are hiring and hiring and hiring, that there are more and more requirements such as PCI, such as NIST, driving pen test if it's dead? I asked myself the question, why is it? So first, well, there's many definitions of what a pen test is. And all of these groups, the Offensive Security, the SANS, EC Council, ISACA, and many others, they all give different definition, and they all give classes or trainings or certifications regarding pen testing, but they don't all have the same definition, which already starts to be worrisome if you're thinking about how can somebody make a claim as bold that pen testing is dead if we don't have a common agreement on what it is. In this talk, I'll give to you what I understand to be a pen test, my vision, and what I think would lead the groundwork regarding what should a pen test be and how to derive value out of it. One other thing, for many people, pen test is basically what we call the Nessus scan or a vulnerability scan, where you have an automated tool and you press next and you have this report saying, oh, these are the findings you have. And for me, that's not a pen test either. I'll get into why, but mostly because you have no intelligence out of it. Like, if automated tools were any good, we would be out of jobs. If there are what we call attack chaining, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but one thing that's important is the capacity for a tester to chain different flaws. Like taking one sometimes you might have two small flaws that by themselves are not dangerous, but when chained together have a much bigger impact. And being able to deliver that capacity and assess the risk and represent the risk to the client is super important. Automated tools don't have this intelligence and thus are not able to provide full value of a pen test. But it's still quite common nowadays in 2022 that we have firms and companies that when they have a pen test, this is the type of thing they receive, or sometimes it's what they expect. So there's a disconnect between what the understanding is versus what is delivered, and that causes many problems. On the other side of the coin, there is what we call tiger teaming or red teaming. So this is a screenshot from the True TV show Tiger Teams. And it's a TV show, a reality show where they followed red teamers and pen testers. And like in this one, they're stealing diamonds, getting through the roof. They had smoke and they, it felt like a heist movie. And for some people, they kind of expect these type of things where they expect the pen testers to drop from an helicopter on the roof of the building and break in using lock picks and then start the fire alarm to be able to bypass. And, this expectation is also not really realistic for many reasons. One reason is the cost. If every test were to be like this, it would be much more expensive. So as you see, there's already not a formal definition. Is tiger teaming or red teaming, like you see here, a pen test? Yeah, it is. But is it every pen test? Certainly not. So here's my assumption. I think pen testing is still alive, but not everyone gets value out of it because there's no formal definition. Not everyone knows how to scope it. Even if you scope it well, many things can go wrong, and I'll talk about this as well. So while pen testing is fully alive, not everyone gets value out of it. So by the end of this talk, my expectations and my hope is that you get better tools how to make sure you scope the pen test properly and how to get more value out of it. So that should be all there is to this talk. Why are people telling us pen testing is dead? Well, the first thing is scoping issues. So I think some pen tests are badly scoped. But before we go this, Ernesto, are there any questions already? I know it's just the intro, so.
No, so far so good, Laurent. We're looking good.
All right. So in this section, I will show you actual excerpt of scoping requests we've had. And I'm sure you'll identify the problem really fast. Dear client, please, I would like an external penetration test of our 2000 IPs and RL web applications. Our budget is 3 days of work, including a full report. Well, if you think per IP, it's less than 4 minutes per IP to test the system. So if your goal is to do the minimal work, like for compliance reason, you might derive value of the checkbox of the compliance. But what will you learn? Like, will you learn anything from this? Will this test provide any value to you? The answer is no. Simply put, real attackers don't have these time constraints. There's a saying among pen testers, if you burn money, at least you warm yourself. In this case, it's even worse. You are actually just spending money for no reason because your attack scope is way too large for the effort that you have. But of course, if we see overscoped attack surface, we also see underscoped attack surface. Please, can you perform an external pen test on our perimeter? Please note that our Exchange, SharePoint, servers, or Student Azure, VPN portal, main website, customer websites are all out of scope. Let me ask you, do you think an attacker will say, oh, I wish I could attack this SharePoint portal. I know it's vulnerable, but I won't because the client wouldn't like this? That's not exactly how it works. Now, to be fair, it's absolutely valid to remove items from your scope. Actually, you should do it. If you have servers that are vulnerable, that are mission critical, like I'm thinking we did pen test on a bank, they had a Swift server. So for people who don't know what a Swift server is, it's a server used to exchange money between banks. and there's like $1.8 billion every hour that goes through that server. They don't want to take the risk of us taking down that server. And for me, it's based on a logical decision. It's totally fine to exclude items from your scope. But if you remove every item from the scope, then of course you won't find anything because there's nothing to test. And once again, you might get a very good checkbox saying we didn't find anything. So again, for compliance, I understand why some people might do this. But in truth, what will you learn after you spend that money on a pen test? What valuable intelligence will you get if you don't test, if your tester doesn't test anything? And that leads to lots of frustration for many clients because, and from testers as well, by the way, because as a pen tester, if I see all these vulnerable systems that I'm not allowed to touch, I kind of feel that I'm doing my test for no reason. But mostly from the client perspective, if you don't scope it properly, you can severely impact your results.
Laurent, question. So do you see a lot of these demands coming from organizations, your customers' organizations coming that are derived from an audit? Or do you see most of these demands coming from organizations that are derived from getting better, improving their security posture?
So it's about, so I'm talking about the industry in general. In general, when you're dealing with companies that are a bit cheaper with less expertise, they will have client will focus on compliance because compliance tests want to find as less as possible, because the more you find, the more you have to justify to your auditors and so on. This is not what we typically do. The role we take are usually the ones of where we want to improve the posture. So I would say if we looked at in Canada and United States, I would say perhaps half the pen tests are for compliance and roughly half the pen tests are for risk management. But ourselves, we're really more focused on those used by risk management. And that's where we really have to focus on things like scope, because if it's misscoped, then it causes lots of issues. But in the industry, I would say about half and half. Do I answer your question?
Half and 50%. And a follow-up question, and are customers focusing on internal pen tests or external pen tests?
That's a super good question. I have slides for this in a minute, but let me give you a little spoiler. I think if you had to do one test, I would do internal first. And the reason I would start with the internal is because you want, once somebody from the external is inside, you'll have to have controls inside as well. So doing inside first makes sense. But what we call the M&M syndrome, do you know what the M&M candy, a hard shell and a soft inside? Most organizations are like this. So once you breach the perimeter inside, it's pretty easy. So I think the best solution is not to do an internal or an external. There are other ways to manage your scope in a way that's, I feel, better. Things with what we call, for example, purple teaming, which I'm going to talk in a minute. But the short answer is, if I had to do just one, I would do an internal.
Perfect.
So, other questions?
No, we're good for now. You may continue.
All right, vague RFPs. Other things, this is an actual quote. Please perform an internal and external pen test in a controlled manner according to our internal guidelines that will include white box or black box testing, social engineering, and red teaming approaches. The pen test should also include automated scanning for vulnerabilities and manual testing approaches. What is this test? I mean, I know from this call that since there's no number of IPs, we didn't know what the internal guideline is. We don't know why red teaming or social engineering should be there. But these are concepts I'm going to talk in a minute. I know that in this case, he got RFPs for $5,000 and $5 million for the same RFP. And I sometimes try to imagine the person who receives for the same RFP 5,000 and 5 million and trying to make sense out of this.
Right.
It's insane. And the reason why it's so difficult, and when I'm a client and I see such a broad range of proposals, I understand why somebody would doubt about the science of pen testing, because clearly the results are not repeatable or the process is not well understood. And one of the reasons was the RFP, of course, but as an industry, since there's no formal definition, and in this case it was vague, you would understand why the client would feel frustration, and no matter which one he took, that might not answer his needs. Because if he went for the $5,000 proposal, certainly that would not cover all his needs. And the one at 5 million, while it might answer all his needs, it might go much, much further than what he really needed, for example. So engagement pitfalls. Let's assume that you did a pen test, you did a scope for a pen test, you scoped it properly using the tools I'm going to talk later. Now, what else could go wrong? So let me show you things that happened in a pen test. So I'm going to have to switch a minute here. Let me know when you see my screen. Do you see my screen?
All good.
All right. So what you're seeing here is a scene from the TV series. So basically what you're seeing right now is in that TV series, there's a virus that the only solution is in the plane right now. And that's a sole copy. So in order to save the world, the hacker has to drive a Ferrari on an airplane trip while somebody else will be dropping a cable from the airplane, and they will hack on the landing strip while the airplane is flying. It is not a typical engagement. So as pen testers, we very rarely, if ever, drive Ferraris while hacking airplanes. But the problem we encounter with this is, and I'm going to just let it run for a minute. Sometimes you wonder if they heard about Bluetooth or Wi-Fi in these videos, but I guess it would be less anyway. So they're doing this.
I think it's an RG45 cable.
Yeah.
With a dongle.
And the hacker saves the day. As you see here, the hacker saves the day. Everyone is happy. And the guy drives a Ferrari. And yeah, that's what this TV series is about. So why I'm showing you this, it's not only for the entertainment value, while it's still pretty funny. The reason why I'm showing you this is because many people, when they're exposed to pen testing and hacking, it's through movies. Like your CIOs and CFOs, when they see pen testers and hackers, it's always through movies. And this colors the interpretation of people a lot. We've tested banks, and after an hour, the client asked, "Are you done?" And we barely had started. But the client in movies, it's always a guy in a hoodie after 5 minutes saying, "I'm in." So they had the expectation. And I'm not laughing at clients here. What I'm saying is, for most people, what they know about are from movies. So sometimes we need to educate people on managing the expectations, because otherwise we'll receive these type of requests. There's a legend about a hacker who whistled in a serial whistle and was able to hack things with this. And it's actually true. It's in early 1960s, but it's not something we can do anymore. So I cannot whistle into a phone to hack a mainframe anymore. But these are the type of requests we've had. So of course, this can lead to disappointment. I'm sure you understand that people have these expectations that don't exactly happen a lot. Oops. Other issue we've had, and this is a bit more sensitive, is some people have asked us things like, "Can you hack my ex emails?" Or we have the union, they're doing things. Can you hack the union to let me know what they're working on? Or can you hack this competitor because we want to know what they're working on? And once again, this is something that is technically possible, but in ethical hacking, the word ethical is at least as important as hacking. And clients don't necessarily mean bad when they think that's the service we provide. They ask us, can you do these? And of course, well, we will say no, but I'm sure you understand that from their perspective, it's just a test. And in movies and these things are done all the time. So, but we have to set an ethical boundary if the client doesn't set one. Other types of issues that happen in an engagement is the not really surprise test. So this is a kind of funny story. Oftentimes when people are doing tests for compliance, they want a clean test. So in order to kind of fudge with the result, they will tell the people ahead. So for example, and this happens quite often, the clients want a phishing test, but they will tell ahead the organization there will be a phishing email sent tomorrow at noon. And then we perform the phishing test, and of course we get great results. But let me ask you, what's the real value of that test? What did you prove? What was the value of this test? In the end, you spent money, but what did you get out of it? Nothing. What you got was just a letter saying you guys did well, but they wouldn't do better in real life. What you have is a dream. What you have is just a letter. We've had clients who, during a pen test, had a system they know was vulnerable. They took it offline for the duration of the test and brought it back up after it. Let me ask again, what's the value out of this? What did you get out of this test? Did you just spend money? Because in the end, if your system is only offline when there's a pen tester, then you're not getting much worth out of it. But furthermore, if you can afford to put it down while there's a pen test, maybe you can afford to put it down all the time, and then perhaps it might be worth it.
It's a delicate topic, right? Because it does address, typically a pen test does address vulnerabilities in your environment, and it could raise flags, throughout the organization. That's why we believe, right? It's very important to get buy-in from key stakeholders within the organization.
Of course.
Right, before we perform it, and really, as you mentioned, just focusing on the scope that we want to perform, a targeted scope, so we can derive value really from addressing those vulnerabilities and looking at how we can correct them. So in real life, really, we can protect against those vulnerabilities and protect against the external threats that we do have.
Even more so, one would argue that I don't think stealth is a good requirement for a pen test. When we're doing pen test, and I'm still going ahead of my slides, but when you're doing a pen test, your goal is to identify as many flaws as possible in as little time. When you're being stealthy, your goal is to be as slow as possible to go behind what we call the CRR, the detection level. And those two objectives go against one another. So to be fast, or to be cheap, you need to be fast. To be stealthy, you need to be slow. So it's very difficult to do both of these things well. So yeah. Oftentimes, for a pen test, I would really not recommend having stealth as a prerequisite. There are other tests, such as red teaming, where stealth is mandatory. But from a pure pen testing perspective, I think having a stealth requirement is setting yourself. One other issue we've encountered, the overly controlled pen test. Testers are required to ask permission before running anything. Clients don't know, but when we're doing a test, we're testing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of techniques. Most of them don't work. Actually, the very large percentage of the things we test, they don't work. But in order to know whether they would work or not, we have to test these. These are the checklist we go through. Like, I'm testing this, does it work? No, let's move on to the next one. So if we need to get approval for every single one, Well, it means we're going to take much more time waiting for approval than we will be actually performing the test. And this comes from a good intent. You want to control your changes. You want to be the person who makes sure there's no impact. So this all makes sense. But this requirement is from people who have not been exposed to pen test and they don't know how big of an ask this is.
Right.
So, which is why I'm letting this as a problem. And finally, the other problems we encounter often is vulnerability exclusion. Please don't use this vulnerability. We know we're vulnerable. Thank you. Okay, once again, the problem is, so we're chaining vulnerabilities. So this vulnerability could be used to find something else later on. So if you block something that would be like the first step of a chain, then you prevent testers from seeing what's behind that first step. But furthermore, if you're looking at it from a risk perspective, hackers don't care. Like if at this point you're saying, don't use this flaw, but you know you're vulnerable, well, at least have the tester put it in the report, at least have some form of way for you to remediate or make it visible to your management so you're able to fix it. Because it's not because the pen testers aren't allowed to test it that you're not at risk. Hackers will still use it. So these are the type of things. Now that I've explained the problems, the most common problems we've encountered, before going to test types, are there any questions, any other questions, worries, or anything?
So far, so good in the chat, Laurent.
All right, great. So this is the fabled pyramid. It's an assessment of basically all the type of services. So we have the base, we have the middle layer, and the top layer. So from us, the base layer is what are called vulnerability assessment. Then we have what are called pen test, and then the top layer is called what we call the strategic services. So first, what's a VA, vulnerability assessment? So a vulnerability assessment is an automated test where you look for flaws. It's fairly simple. There are lots of tools that are very good at it. Things like Nessus, Nexpose, there's lots of them. But first, let me tell you, this is not a pen test. So if we could all repeat together, a vulnerability assessment is not a pen test. If it's the one thing we should all get out of this, it would have been worthwhile. Don't get me wrong, a vulnerability assessment is super useful. My opinion is that a vulnerability assessment should be done in-house. I don't think there's also value of having a third party doing this. By having it in-house, you have a better control of inventory. You can do it on demand. For me, this should be more in-house. But nonetheless, it's not a pen test. Now, if you don't have patching, vulnerability management, or patching, or vulnerability assessment capabilities, you don't need to do a pen test. There's no use of you doing a pen test if you don't patch. I'll give you this free pen test. They're going to get in, you didn't patch. So instead, all that money you would spend on having a pen test to let you know this, invest it instead on having a vulnerability management program, purchasing licensing for these tools at a VA, because if you don't manage your patching, there's no reason for you to do a pen test. Simply put, because they're going to get in through missing patches, it's going to be a boring report, and they're going to tell you something you know already. So the first step would be to do a VA. And I repeat once again, from my understanding or the way I see it, it's much better if this capability is in-house because it helps with inventory. You can do it on demand. There's lots of benefits of having it in-house.
So I have a question, Laurent, here. The question is a vulnerability assessment a pen test?
No.
Okay. Is it a good start for organizations? So you're identifying it as a good start for organizations to get started, for them to start and understand their environment, and then maybe take the results from their internal VA and have the information needed to really scope out a pen test going forward? Is that how they should use this to start?
At least to know to patch their assets or to identify what assets they should patch, because otherwise the pen test will be very, very easy.
It will be deemed useless.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's a first step. And I repeat, I don't think you should use a third party. It'll be way too expensive. Because when you think about it, a vulnerability assessment doesn't need any expertise. You enter the IPs, you press next, you get a report. So hiring an expert that you're going to pay $300, $400 an hour to do this, I mean, of course, we'll take your money, but there's no reason for having an expert to do this where anybody with a capability to do copy paste should do it, right? The value you'll get is how you respond out of this report and how you do management, and having the internal knowledge, knowing the sysadmin, being able to have the political and knowledge of the organization to be able to navigate and make sure you push vulnerability management is much more important for these type of projects, and that requires internal skills. So that's why I'm saying it should be in-house. Now, pen testing. So there's a plethora of types of pen test. So we talked about internal, external, but there are web apps, there are Wi-Fi, there's code review, there's mainframe. Like there's so many types of pen test you can do. But there are a few things that that you should focus on for it to be a pen test. First, the test has to be manual, at least in some forms. If you're only relying on a tool and not the expertise of a tester, you're missing a lot. Also, there should be attack chaining. So attack chaining is showing that using exploit A, we were able to derive data first from something, and then we use flaw B and so on. Because this chain of vulnerability is something that provides you value. And finally, and I mentioned already, I don't believe it has to be stealthy. I think that doing it stealth is setting yourself for an error. And so these are the common type of pen test. The most common you'll see are web apps, internal and external, but there are so many others, phishing. And if you have a specific need that's super weird, feel free to reach out to any pen testing firm, and sometimes they'll be able to help. We have clients who ask like for SAP testing. So SAP is a ERP, it's fairly large, and it's difficult to find expertise in testing, for example, SAP. So nowadays, we have a service that's what we do exactly this because nobody else can test it. But the most common are mobile, web, internal, external, phishing, these type of things. And I repeat, what makes it a pen test from my perspective is manual and attack chaining. If you have these two things, then you're in a place where you have a setup for a pen test. Now that I've talked to you about pen testing and vulnerability assessment, let's move to our layer that we call strategic services. So strategic services, basically what they are is we are trying to assess how good the blue team is. So the blue team is the defense side, the security operations center. So most organizations, they invest a lot in SIM, in EDR, in SOC. They do a lot of investment, but how do you know how good are they? Like, you've made all this investment, but how do you rate them? How do you know if your investment is good? Well, in truth, you have a threat being the hackers trying to assess the blue team. And this time they are trying to be stealthy. They're trying to emulate real threats. The idea here is that this is a much more long assessment. Typically, we would see 60 days, 90 days, 120 days of work per assessment. So it's much bigger than your average pen test. One thing that for me is super important is the no shaming rules, because this can get pretty adversarial where the blue team says the red team says the blue team didn't find this and so on. And this is meant to be positive. So, and I've seen horrible reports from both sides that shame the other side. The idea is more to assess process and detection capabilities. So this is what a red teaming is. Now, if there's a red team, there's purple team. And what is purple teaming is collaborative pen test. So the idea is we work together with the blue team and we really try to improve detections and reaction. And we do it by focusing on one aspect at a time. So say 1 week is lateral movement. We do all the lateral movement techniques we know. We try to identify gaps between the technique and the detection. We fix it and we move on and move on and move on. And really that's, from my belief, that's the future of pen testing. It's non-adversarial. The client gets value out of it. There's some coaching. The client by the end has more tool to respond by themselves. They're more independent. From my perspective, that's the future pen testing.
There's a lot more collaboration, right? Like you said, from the
Very
internal
much so.
team, from the
Yes.
external team, right? Where
Yes.
the goal is to get better, right? Versus
Mhm.
exposing it and pointing fingers, right? So if the goal is to get better, right, collaboration is the right way to go.
That's correct. And furthermore, when you're doing a red team, what you get by the end is a list of things to fix. When you're doing a purple team, what you have in the end is a list of things you have fixed. It's a very different message you're sending to your management at that point.
Great point, Laurent. Great point. Just doing a quick time check.
Yes.
It's 1:43, 15
Mhm.
minutes left. So I'll let you continue and we'll leave 5-10 minutes for some questions.
Yes, we're almost done. But do you have any?
Awesome.
We have any other questions at this point regarding types of tests or comments?
We have a question in regards to what VA options are. Can you suggest any for
Well,
people on the
if
call?
you're doing this internally, I would recommend you use authenticated VA. So there are several flavors, ways to do vulnerability assessment, but the best way is to have a scanner that has an account to be able to log into the systems. So you have visibility not only on what's visible on the network, but also on the systems. Think about Adobe PDF Reader. From the outside, you cannot know whether or not the Adobe is up to date, but if you log in, if the tools logs in, it works really well. I really like Nessus, but I've heard great things about Nexpose and Qualys as well. So as for which one, I think they all pretty much are good in that regard. But authenticated is the way to go if you're doing it in-house, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. So as everyone knows, this workshop is being recorded and we'll follow up with the recording and we'll follow up with the FAQs with the recommended VAs.
All right, so the question now is what's the right test for you? Because we've talked about all these things, but which one should you pick and what's the value? So many people think a VA is less good than a pen test, which is less good than a red team. But in truth, one test goes into the other. I think that if you're not performing a VA, considering a pen test is a mistake. And if you're not doing a pen test, considering a red team is a mistake. But that being said, there's no shame in being at a vulnerability assessment step. As long as you understand you're at that step, and because we all need to start somewhere. The problem we encounter more are clients who aren't ready and they want a red team, and it's very difficult for them, and these are not good results they want to show their management. So yeah,
It gets put in a drawer somewhere, right?
exactly. Now, how to derive value out of a test? So I've talked about all these things, but like how to get value out of it? First, have a goal. So why are you doing these tests? And I know it's obvious as a question, but when you think about it, if you don't know about this, then doing anything after, if your goal is not set properly, everything else cannot be right. So do you want to validate your patching level? Well, then perhaps a VA is all right. Would you like to emulate one threat? Would you like to assess the effectiveness of your blue team? Depending of what you want, it'll tell you already what type of test you want. Choose your threat. So this is our pyramid of pain. So that's how we assess threats. So we believe that automated scripts are the most common and the less sophisticated attackers. Then we have script kiddies, opportunistic attacker. So an opportunistic attacker, you don't need to outrun the bear. You only need to outrun your neighbor. I'm sure you've heard a saying like this. Well, an opportunistic attacker, if you're good enough that the hacker moves somewhere else, you're all set. And that's where we set the line for due diligence. My understanding of the risk is you need to at least protect yourselves against these these bottom three attackers. Now, targeted attackers is the same. You would think you don't need to outrun the bear, just the neighbor, but it's only true unless if you're covered in honey, then the bear is out for you, and then it's a much more difficult challenge. And then state actors like NSA, China, or whatever, these type of people. And depending of what threats you encounter, well, then you have a quite different type of test.
Right.
Have an inventory, you already mentioned it, but of course, if you don't have an inventory, how do you know you're covering everything? There's a pen tester saying if your client has time to read the report, you got the wrong client. Basically, ask for a presentation. It'll be much more effective, but nonetheless, ask for a report, because the report are the proof you did it. You have written recommendations. You get lots of value out of the report. But for me, having a presentation where you can have key stakeholders and have technical people on board, you derive much more value than just sharing the 300-page report. So if you can ask for a presentation, you get value out of it. Avoid scoping issues and pitfalls. Reach out to your pen testing firms. If you don't know how to scope it, pen testers, organizations such as Assurance IT or GoSecure, they've scoped pen tests before. They can help you with making sure you have the right fit. Avoid cool. If you're in a meeting scoping for pen test and you hear, oh, this is so cool, we're going to do this. Well, that's not a good business valid reason. And we had clients that wanted to do this because it was cool, but it's never how you get value out of it. Avoid blame. So this is a problem where when you're fixing this, sometimes people will be identified. Like somebody opened an email and that email the understanding would be we'll fire the person who opened the email. But I think this is missing. You're seeing the three and missing the forest here. The problem is not Larry opened the email. The problem is the organization didn't have controls in place that prevented the email from getting in. The organization didn't do proper security awareness. So if you blame people, the problem will come back again and again and again. So when you're going to remediation, you really need to avoid assigning blame. This creates the most toxic security culture you face, and that can lead to really big problems. So finally,
I think that's the number one reason why the outcomes of pen tests fail, right? It's avoiding blame and understanding that we're here to work together. Blue and red, right, equals purple, right? Work together and come to conclusions, come to solutions, put forward some solutions in order to get a successful pen test. Just my input, but I believe that that's the number one upper.
So now, what's the future? Well, as I mentioned, I think for me, the future is purple teaming. That's really where there's collaboration, and that's where we provide the most value for clients. Yeah, that's it. Questions?
That's it. Fantastic. Thank you, Laurent. That was fantastic. In regards to questions in the chat, I think it was interactive. So we asked questions as we went. I'll wait. Feel free to, anyone in the chat or in the work group session, feel free to unmute themselves to ask the question. If not, I'll be waiting a couple of minutes here and seeing if there's any questions in the chat. I see Giacomo's typing away here, so wait for his question. So again, the question from Giacomo is, what does a post pen test look like for an organization?
It's a really good question. So here's the happy path. So not all organizations take the happy path, but here's what I would expect. So for most, let's talk from the perspective of an internal pen test is the most common. We would perform a test, then have at least one meeting with the technical people, a presentation where we can go over the fix and ask questions and so on. Then usually we would redo a test the following year, taking into account what was tested. So typically that's usually pretty light. It's a meeting and another test the following year. For things like web app or applications that are more mission critical, sometimes the clients ask for a retest. And one thing you should take into account is if your organization charges the same price for a retest that they charge for the normal test, then you're paying too much, because a retest usually should be much, much, much faster than the right test. Because as I told you before, when we're doing a test, there's hundreds of things that we test that don't work, but we have to go through. The other way around, we have a list of vulnerabilities when we know whether or not they're still there. It should be much, much, much cheaper. I hope I answered your question.
I think you hit the point, right, Laurent? So it's very important when you perform a pen test to follow up, because you want to understand, did your efforts really lead to success, right? Did it really close the gaps, and were you able to protect once you did the initial one, perform another pen test, typically on a yearly basis? That's what you recommend.
Yes, but even more so, and I think I didn't put in my slides, but thinking on it, we should, is if you're doing all these things and you don't fix anything, you barely spend money for no reason. Yeah. And this is something we do encounter, though. This something happens. I
Well,
see we have a. Oh, please.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, no, it'll definitely, though, if you do them for no reason and you keep on doing them, it'll definitely allow you to get that Ferrari, Laurent. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
of course. I see
We do-
there's a great question by Ann Tursky about is there any difference if the systems are in the cloud? So cloud testing is a bit different for two reasons. This is totally possible, by the way. There's people believe it's impossible to test in the cloud. It is possible, but there are some caveats. For example, depending of the what technology you're assessing, some service providers don't want you to test. For example, I'll take Amazon. So Amazon, you can have your own tenant. So basically, these are your computers, but they're in the cloud, and these we can test all we want, no problem. But when there are systems that are shared between clients, things like Route 53, for example, that's a service by Amazon for managing DNS. Well, these ones, there's an impact for many clients if we test it and we break something. So then it's much more difficult and we need to talk with Amazon and there's discussions and so on. But it's not impossible, but it's different. But I don't think it's impossible. It's just a different flavor of a pen test. I would recommend you talk with your pen testing firm to go through to make sure you scope it properly, but it should not be a stop. It should just be, let's see what the provider wants and where are the limits.
So I guess when a customer wants to initiate or have a conversation around which pen test would work for them, I guess working with us, Laurent, we've done these in the past, working with us to really scope it out and understand what the scope, identifying the scope, and would be the key characteristic or the first start in getting going.
But it's not mandatory, but keep in mind that most pen testing organizations are used to scoping these and they have experience. So oftentimes the pen testing firms can provide value or suggestions, but just be wary about upsellers because the problem is not all pen testing companies are ethical. So just be worried about, firms sending you a red team when you need a VA. But involving them, if you know what you want, but you're not sure which service, for example, and I think it's a good moment to have a discussion with a salesperson or an expert from the pen testing firm. I really hope I answered your question.
I think you did great points. Yeah, no, definitely, right? So really focus in on the scope and make sure that you work with a trusted provider when you're going forward with a pen test, really to uncover those vulnerabilities, because it is a partnership, right? It's a value-added service where if you do implement it correctly, or if you focus in on the long term, it's definitely something that you're working hand in hand with your provider and you establish a relationship, because in the end, you're working together to resolve the common issue. Laurent, would you like to add anything?
One more comment that I didn't see in writing, but I want to make sure is some pen testing firms are also into remediation. And for me, it should be a warning or a red flag because you want independence. So your report, like for example, the pen testing report should never say purchase this firewall from this manufacturer. Independence is super important. So make sure when you're dealing with a firm, you're dealing with pen testing firms who are independent, or because otherwise you can set yourself up for a pretty expensive surprise.
Good point. Good point. Well, I think that's it, guys. Well, thank you very much again. It was a pleasure. Laurent, was a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time
Thanks
to
again.
today. Definitely a lot of value, and feel free to reach out to the Assurance IT team or the Go Secure team to help you with your pen test going forward. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.